Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. We are in tariff week, even on planet tariff, following the decision by President Donald Trump to impose tariffs on several of the US's key trading partners, allies and rivals. He recently labelled tariffs a beautiful thing, but China, Mexico and Canada certainly don't think so after he took the decision to impose them on goods from their countries, although he has paused those in the case of Canada and Mexico. It has left the world reeling. The European Union is now firmly in his sights. The good news for Britain is that Trump has called Keir Starmer someone he gets on with very well, doing a very good job, so possibly there is a reprieve for now. But this has ripped up 30 years of free trade, work towards freer trade, and even more than that, an assumption about how the US would position itself in the world. To discuss all this, I'm joined by the economist and broadcaster Linda Yueh, who's a fellow in economics at Oxford University, one of our associate fellows, and also by Mexican diplomat Julian Ventura, another of our associate fellows, and our very own Creon Butler, who leads our Global Economy and Finance program. Great to have you here in this extraordinary week. Well, Creon, let me start with you. Do tariffs ever work?
Well, it's a good question. I think in the context in which President Trump is using them, which is kind of a form of economic coercion, firstly, I think it's pretty unique the way he's using them. And secondly, the evidence so far is that depending on what his objective was, it may have had an effect in terms of bringing forward some of the actions by Mexico and Canada in strengthening their borders, but it hasn't fundamentally changed the approach of those countries in terms of their underlying economic structures, their trade performance, and so on. And I would be very surprised if it did. In terms of a longer time frame, if you go back to the sort of 1970s, 1980s, there were countries that had tariff policies where they exported to the wider world. They protected their own markets, and through that they were able to develop strong economies.
Which countries are you thinking of?
So in Southeast Asia, some of the four tigers, as they're now known, adopted policies of that kind. But in a way, it was in a very different type of global environment to that today. Other countries were, in a way, willing to allow that to happen. And also they had the domestic economic policies that made that work. So one of the problems with tariff protection is that you lose the dynamism in your domestic economy. You don't have access to the best products, the best services, and so on from overseas, particularly if you face a kind of retaliation from other countries. So I think that was a very special situation in which that was for part of industrial strategy for relatively small economies. I don't think in any way it works for a very large economy like the US. And I think if President Trump were to continue with this policy, he would quickly find that that was the case.
He has, of course, paused the tariffs against Mexico and Canada for the moment. We'll see what happens there. But is there a danger that this actually backfires on him?
I think there is a danger.
By which I mean hurting the US economy.
Well, obviously we don't know quite how it's going to work out, but on the assumption that the threat of tariffs remains indefinitely, this will certainly create uncertainty about investment in the US. It will lead private companies around the world to kind of organize their supply chains to some extent to avoid the US because of that uncertainty. And that over time will have, I would think, quite a considerable impact on the US economy.
Linda, you've been writing a lot about this. What do you think of this first question of whether they can ever work?
So, Bronwen, I wrote a book on about 250 years of economic history, and it was condensed into a Harvard Business School, Harvard Business Review article called 250 Years of Tariffs. And I'm not going to go through 250 years, but I'm just going to add to what Creon has said. And tariffs can work, but at what cost? So we have had tariffs, which are a tax throughout history. He referred to the infant industry argument used by developing countries. So their companies can grow while they are developing so that they can compete against established companies. That's one example. until we had the era of globalization, tariffs as a form of taxation raised revenue. But I would say since about the mid-19th century, we understand that tariffs are not an efficient way of raising revenues or managing your economy. However, mercantilism, this idea that you like to run trade surpluses, and therefore President Trump's targeting of countries that run trade surpluses with the U.S., that's a concept that we thought had kind of faded away, but it has reared its head, not just in the U.S.
We'll
but
come
also
on to that
elsewhere.
in a moment. Faded away from failure, many would suggest. But I want to come to Julian now. Julian, this extraordinary week, particularly for Mexico and Canada, the closest trading partners of the US. I'm struggling for words almost to capture what diplomats must be feeling there. But how do Mexico and Canada go about responding to this?
Well, certainly it has been a very tense few days. I think that the best result, given the cards that both countries have been dealt, is good in the sense that we have a 30-day reprieve to work on some of the issues that President Trump has targeted related to border, fentanyl trafficking, immigration, and trade issues. It'll be a work in progress, and this sort of overhang of uncertainty is going to remain for a while. I think that's not going to change regardless of the reprieve. But like you say, the threat of tariffs are a shot across the bow of 30 years of North American integration that, however imperfectly, clearly benefit the United States. The tariff approach, Linda has elaborated on that, is kind of a cluster munition effect that impacts consumers in the three countries, that hits inflation, that disrupts very integrated supply chains, like in the automotive and aerospace sectors, and in which the trade flows are tremendously complex. The automotive sector, which is a hallmark of North American integration, Mexican exports have on the average 40% U.S. content. And they cross the two borders, several times before they become a finished product. So the multiplier effect is incredible. And the two countries are going to have to buckle down, start the consultation processes that have been announced on Monday, and try to show, at least in the public narrative, some demonstrable progress on those non-trade related issues that are going to be top of mind in the White House for the next 4 years.
You've put your finger on something important, which is that President Trump is using these to try to do something about non-trade issues, fentanyl and migration in particular. Do you think that Mexico is susceptible to this kind of pressure on that?
Well, it has a mixture of a national interest in contributing to clamp down on those issues. It has been doing so before the tariff threat was announced by the president. The tensions at the border are down by about 75%. Fentanyl trafficking, and much higher from Mexico than from Canada, is like finding a needle in a haystack. Approximately, a year's supply of fentanyl can fit into one container truck. And if you think that about 7 million trucks cross the U.S.-Mexico border and 6 million trucks cross the Mexican border, then that 90% of fentanyl comes across in individual cars, vehicles driven by U.S. citizens. It's very difficult. But the country's, deploying 10,000 troops on the border crossing points. So it's important in this war of perceptions, when there are no clear indicators, that the two countries show that in their border actions, that in their cooperation on repatriations, are making some kind of tangible progress on these issues. But definitely, I think Canada's case is applicable as well. They are moving forward on this, and they're going to have to move forward much faster on it.
As they've been saying very loudly this week, only a tiny fraction of the fentanyl that gets into the US. And I must say, I do find it shocking. I remember standing in Texas as NAFTA was being put together down the Texan border, and that represented years and years of people picking away at documents to try to get this free trade across the borders going, and ripped up or suspended in hours. Creon, what does it do to the actual trade across these borders?
The approach President Trump has taken is not normal. To have a goal of this kind, and rather than to reach out and say, we have a real problem of fentanyl, we want to discuss how we can resolve this collectively since it's our common interest, to start off with 25% tariffs as essentially economic coercion, which a couple of years ago, the G7 worked on a plan to deal with economic coercion, is an extraordinary approach and has very serious long-term effects. In terms of how the tariff measures would, impact on trade across the border. I mean, we've seen in the Brexit experience, it's actually not just the tariffs. It's all the other things that go with trade restrictions. I mean, the UK...
Are you thinking of paperwork?
Paperwork and so on.
Yep.
I mean, so the UK is currently, we don't have any tariffs with the EU, and yet we've seen a significant impact from the extra paperwork, the investigations, things of that kind, related from withdrawing from the EU. Now, in the case of US-Mexico trade or US-Canada trade, alongside, if you like, the threat of tariffs, you probably will have quite considerable additional checks and controls and so on the border flows, some of which may be actually necessary, to suppress fentanyl traffic. But, the whole climate of how trade is going to work across the borders, the lack of trust, is going to have also a very chilling effect on the economic space that was created as a result of NAFTA and then its successor. And our Brexit experience just shows how significant that can be. Including
on the US.
I think on the US as well. I mean, the US is a very big economy, but these are its two largest trading partners. The extraordinary thing about President Trump's sort of starting point is he put 25% on 40%, was threatening to put 25% tariffs on 40% plus of US trade. I mean, extraordinary thing to do. It hasn't followed through. And so the real question is, what did he really intend as a result of that? Because if he had actually intended to have those tariffs and keep them in place, a truly remarkable, extraordinary thing to do in terms of harm to US economy.
Let's come on to China, the other country affected by that this week. There may be more, of course, as I was saying at the beginning. Linda, what is the impact on China and how do you expect it to respond?
Well, China's already responded because they have levied themselves, just like everybody else, tit-for-tat tariffs, very targeted. And so 3 areas: energy is the first one, and rare earths, which are critical minerals that go into things like iPhones. And then they've essentially launched antitrust investigation into big U.S. multinationals, so the equivalent of their own entity list, as it were. So I think this is very much like what happened under Trump 1.0, where the retaliation, and we saw that with other countries as well, is very specific, as in 2018, the tariffs were on the Rust Belt workers, which were Trump voters, that as Trump was running for re-election at that point. And now the energy focus, for instance, of Chinese tariffs reflects one of the 3 prongs of the Treasury Secretary's 333 plan, which is around, energy. And so I think, like what happened with Canada and Mexico, and indeed with Colombia, I think these are just chips that get put on the table, and they'll negotiate, and some of the chips will come off, and they will come out with maybe not a truce, because this is China. It is a different creature, unfortunately, when it comes to the U.S. than some of the other countries. But I think this is just one long, drawn-out negotiation, which, President Trump, he did write a book called The Art of the Deal. So I think this is just the pattern we're going to probably have to expect in the next 4 years.
Julian, go on.
No, on the China side, keep an eye on the fentanyl dimension of the China factor. when President Trump imposed tariffs during his first term on China, very significant tariffs, China quietly stopped its customs enforcement and its inspections of the laboratories which produce and export precursors to North America. That dramatically changed the scale of overdoses in the United States.
Increased
it. Changed the
Increased,
patterns.
Increased it. Yeah.
It increased it. It changed the patterns of flows. Most fentanyl was directly exported from China to the United States before those measures were implemented. And the Mexico and Canada imports of precursors and exports of fentanyl changed dramatically because of that action. So we won't see that visibly, but let's keep an eye on what China does on the fentanyl side, which is an issue that, regardless of how much it's not trade related, it's an issue that Trump cares about very much.
He clearly does. I mean, he's made it almost the centerpiece of this. Creon, are you surprised at that? That fentanyl has been given as obviously this opioid epidemic has devastated parts of America, particularly rural and small town America.
Not at all. I'm not surprised that this is a major issue for Trump or for President Trump or for the American public. What I am really surprised is, for example, in relation to a country like Canada, one of the US's closest allies. I mean, it's hard to imagine a country with which you could have more close police law enforcement cooperation than Canada.
I think it's the longest unguarded
Indeed,
border in the world.
Just the closeness, of law enforcement agencies between the two countries. How, if what you want to do is to restrict the flows of fentanyl from Canada, that you approach it in the way that President Trump chose to do it, rather than say we need collectively to work on a much better border practice. And as I understand it, many of the measures that are now being put in place were announced by Prime Minister Trudeau actually in December. So before, these are the things that were kind of agreed as part of that call, but nonetheless, they were already in place as a result of Canada thinking through. Now, relationship with each country is different. With Mexico, it may be maybe a more complicated relationship. But it is a real surprise that this is how he approaches what is a very understandable concern within the US about inflows of this drug.
What about President Trump's antipathy to the idea that countries might have a trading surplus with the US?
It makes no sense in a way that...
Just explain for everyone what a trading surplus is.
So what he appears to be focused on is the bilateral difference between exports and imports. So how much to a particular country. The difference currently between imports from Mexico and US exports to Mexico, it's about $150 billion a year. And with different parts of the world, I mean, with the EU, it's an even bigger figure. Now, his view is that is a bad thing. Now, in practice, this may simply reflect the fact that Mexico makes things that U.S. consumers, U.S. firms need and make better than the U.S. can make itself. This actually not only increases the standard of living for U.S. consumers, it also makes U.S., as indeed was pointed out, the U.S. firms more competitive in terms of the things they export elsewhere, including that content from
And
Mexico.
those countries tend to use the proceeds of that, stick it in dollars.
And indeed, to invest, but also to buy things from other countries, which then import from the U.S. So, the whole world trading system does not in any way pick out bilateral trade surpluses or deficits as being a problem. Now, if you are a country and you have an overall trade deficit for a sustained period of time, for many countries that can be a problem. For the US, typically it's not a problem because actually it's able to finance that through the fact that the world uses its currency as the global reserve currency, although ultimately it may become a problem. So there is a reason to be concerned about your total trade deficit vis-a-vis other countries, and in other respects about a trade surplus, but not in any sense about the bilateral trade deficit or surplus.
The country-to-country
Exactly.
Deficit or surplus. So Creon's been setting out, if you like, the voice of reason here, what economists think about this. Julian, do you think there is any point for other countries to try to have that kind of argument with the US that this really makes no economic sense? Or are we really into just something that is not an economic argument at all?
I think it's important to do it. And in many ways, the experience of Mexico and Canada over the last couple of days should give some guidance to other partners that are looking around the world. The European Council met this week. The conversation was focused on defense, but that conversation and that internal dialogue is going to have to shift quickly. Just like during President Trump's first term in office, the world was watching and Europe was watching to see if through the USMCA negotiation, it was possible to negotiate with Donald Trump. They're going to have to be looking closely at the North American experience in the last few days and in the coming weeks. So definitely there's a combination of economic rationale, of coalescing or building coalitions of the business communities that will be affected, forging a political consensus that will allow a player like Europe and some of the US's Asian partners to find the most rational possible way forward in the coming 4 years.
How would you advise Europe? Europe does have a big trade surplus with the US, so it may well be one of the next targets.
It very well could be. I think that from what we saw, the way President Sheinbaum on the Mexican side handled the situation with a cool head, discreet, prudent negotiations, building internal consensus, is a big part of how players such as Europe should dive into this new dynamics with the United States. I mean, there's a lot at stake. Economic rationale will not rule in most cases. So a transactional approach where a lot of other non-trade related things are going to be put in the basket, whether it's defense or whether it's even some migration issues regarding the Mediterranean policies, is going to be on the table very directly.
Linda, I wonder if you could help us explore just a bit more this one of these questions that has been here throughout this discussion about whether this is going to come back to bite President Trump, or whether it's going to hurt the US economy. There's been a lot of discussion in the past week or two, even in Creon's musing in one of our research meetings about whether we might have seen peak Trump in the sense that the economy could be a real constraint on him. So is he bringing himself all kinds of problems in doing this?
I think the combination of policies, so tariffs and extending the 2017 tax cuts, I think the combination of things that he's doing is potentially inflationary. And so, for instance, we've talked about tariffs, which is the tax on imports. So this is what U.S. consumers and businesses buy. And trade is not a massive part of the U.S. economy. So I think that's one of the things just to stress. The U.S. economy tends to run on domestic demand. So basically what happens internally. So which is why I'm raising the issue of the tax cuts. If he does extend the tax cuts and it's financed through deficits, so borrowing to fund them, then you do end up with all the ingredients of domestic inflation with a bit of imported inflation. So when inflation goes up, people don't feel better off. Interest rates may not come down as quickly as people would like, and interest rates affect people's mortgages, they affect the cost of borrowing. So I think in that sense, if these measures, and this is a big if, because on the tariffs so far, they've been threatened but not really imposed because truce has been called pretty quickly, or Colombia let the plane land with, the American plane land. That was the issue, and China's is ongoing. There is the potential that his policies could boost growth, but in an inflationary way. And that, I think, would be something that could rein him back a bit, because ultimately, he's going to keep an eye out on what's happening, to U.S. growth. I mentioned there's Scott Bessent's 333 plan.
Yes, you did. You did. And it struck me listening to some of his speeches recently that someone has said to him, Mr. President, there is a thing called inflation, because he's mentioning it quite a lot and asking countries like the Saudis to do something about it, but it can come and bite him very quickly politically in the House of Representatives elections where Republicans have just a majority of a few, and those are in 2 years, and the cost of living is something that really is on voters' minds on those. As we come towards the end of this, I wonder if we all just take a step back, and I'm reaching again, for my own sense of shock on this, because as I was saying at the beginning, this really overturns so much of what the world had been taking for granted in the past 30 years, but really, really more, going back to the Second World War. Julian, I wonder if you could give me your thoughts on that. This is stepping back from globalization, from free trade, and also from the role that the U.S. had been taking in the world.
Very much so. If you take the example of Canada and Mexico, the decision to pursue closer North American integration 30 years ago was not taken easily. Historical considerations, nationalist tendencies in both countries were subjected to very vigorous debate, both in Canada and in Mexico, and a kind of a leap of faith was taken to bet on North America, because this trend that we saw toward globalization was something that was taken as a given in international relations. And these things that we saw over the weekend really hurt long-term trust and predictability. And we saw in Canada very clearly, and in Mexico, where some nationalist views have come to the surface, legitimate concerns. And that is definitely going to create a change beyond the resolution of this specific tariff issue on the vigor and the muscle with which big trading economies approach engagement with the U.S., a process that has, by any account, benefited the U.S. Greatly in terms of its global competitiveness, but also in terms of its standing in the world.
Absolutely. And Linda, is this a big change for you? Or, look, are we looking at Trump and his negotiating ploys and this will all blow away?
I don't know that, it's hard to say what's going to happen, but I think one of the things I think will stay is, there's really no such thing as free trade. So we talk a lot about freer trade, but there's been a sense that trade is not just not free, it's not fair. And I think that sense is going to stay with us for some time. So do some countries subsidize their exports? Are they protecting and distorting competition, hurting American workers and consumers? I think that's actually going to stay for a while. And coming back to damage to the U.S., that kind of inefficient distortion means that supply chains become quite uncertain and investments become deterred and trading costs go up. And I think that I'm not sure how long that will stay, but that is a challenge to how global trade has been done for decades. And then just finally, the weaponization of trade to deal with non-trade issues like the opiate crisis or immigration, or the case, just to broaden it out, Japan and Korea have been in a trade war, but has nothing really to do with trade, not much to do with trade. That's a fundamental change in how we think about economics and geopolitics, and thus the new term, geoeconomics.
Absolutely. Creon has been I'm not going to say victim of this all week, as economics becomes absolutely central to everything Chatham House is doing. Creon, your thoughts?
I think it is a big change, but I think it's important to take account that it is really only the US that is saying we're going to step outside the WTO process for dealing with trade disputes, for considering new areas of kind of global trade rules and so on. I mean, certainly there is enormous frustration within the WTO from, say, Europe.
This is the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, the World Trade from Europe versus, for example, Chinese state subsidies and so on. But I think every other country other than the US would have continued with the WTO as the mechanism for if you like, moderating these trends towards fragmentation, to manage the kind of security concerns about trade and so on. It's only the US that's stepping outside. So there is a kind of question for me, which is, does the rest of the world in a way accept the challenge from the US, follow their route, or do they say, no, actually, we want to maintain this kind of rules-based approach, the kind of norms with all its imperfections and continue through that route? And then do they have the opportunity to do it? Or in a way, does the US find a way, or President Trump find a way of frustrating that? For me, that's a really interesting question going forward.
All right, that's a good question on which to leave this. We're going to have to wrap up there, and I don't normally like to do that, leaving a question, but we have to, given how many questions there are in the world at the moment. A really warm thanks to my guests, Linda Yueh, Julian Ventura, Creon Butler. Do follow them all on X and Blue Sky. You can also find Chatham House there. All the details are in the show notes as usual. And if you want to hear more about today's topic and what's on our minds at Chatham House on this, we do have a special live stream event on the 7th of February, aptly called The Rewriting of North America, How Are Canada and Mexico Adapting to President Trump. Details are on our website. Julian will be on that panel too, where I'm confident he'll share even more of his insights. A reminder that you can listen to all episodes of Independent Thinking on Apple, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, subscribe, and tell your friends. That really means that more people will find us, listen to the show, and give us their ideas, which is what we thrive on. For now, that's it from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next time.